Hello. It's been a very interesting day in Ukraine the last 24 hours. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the battle activity that's been going on in that period, and also then talk about some of the possible causes of the massive destruction of Western armour that has occurred over the last week in the start of the Ukrainian offensive. As many of you will have seen the images of multiple Leopard tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles and other Western supplied armour clumped together, destroyed in minefields. Yeah, I'll have a little bit of a chat about some of that. There's been some really good thinking put into that by some of the online analysts. We might just go over a little bit of that. But in terms of the fighting in the last 24 hours, what's been interesting is that the reports have come out that the Ukrainian forces have captured some land, have captured a couple of smaller townships, Neskuchne and Blatadatne in the Zaporozhye region. We can might even just have a quick look here on the map and just see where are we here. If we have a look around here, we've got the Zaporozhye region around here, Melitopol, Mariupol down here. Now around Neskuchne is where some of the advances have been made today by the Ukrainian forces. I'll just get in a little closer here. And if I roughly draw a line, if we go kind of around here, everywhere north of this line seems to be reportedly captured by the Ukrainians. Now, Neskuchne, Makarivka down here, this is now on the live UA map appearing as possibly being under Ukrainian control. These are smaller towns, areas that have been captured. Some of them have had changed hands a number of times over the last week, and the Neskuchne being one of those places. I think it's important to just balance out that these small gains, which are receiving a lot of media attention, obviously in the West because it's a Ukrainian advance, need to be balanced out with some of the other activity that's also happened in the last 24 hours. Also, one thing to note is that these areas, Neskuchne and Blatadatne through here, are in following through on this river area, are in a valley. The area up here to the west is a raised area, some of the hills in this area, which are still controlled by the Russians. So the Russians still probably have quite good fire control over some of these areas anyhow. Now, what's also interesting is that while these advances have been made through this area, they're still quite a distance away from the Russian strongholds. Now, if we just zoom out a little bit here, the Russian strongholds really run kind of across this line, roughly across here. So there's quite a distance that the Ukrainians still have to travel and get through before they get to the real solid Russian defensive line. As people have mentioned, the area which the Ukrainians are advancing into now is kind of considered a grey zone, or possibly a crumple zone, as Simplicius the thinker refers to them, which is an area where the Russians do have troops in that area, have locations marked, are able to strike with artillery, but they are quite lightly defended. And the idea is not to necessarily defend these areas in great depth, but rather to defend, slow down the Ukrainian advances, and then fall back and try to suffer as few losses as possible, and then call in the overmatched Russian artillery onto the Ukrainians as they move into these known locations. For example, the Ukrainians capturing a place like Neskuchne, it's an advance, certainly, but this is an area that the Russians have dialed in exactly to their artillery. So as soon as the Russians pull out of there and the Ukrainians move in, the Ukrainians come in under heavy artillery. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens here over the next days and weeks to see if perhaps the Ukrainians do use this opening that they've gained here, and then perhaps send in a much larger force with, some of the rumoured 400 to 500 or 600 claimed in some reports tanks that the Ukrainians may have. It seems like a large number of tanks for them to have, but they may. I think 400 in that region is probably quite possible, given the number of brigades that are on the battlefront there. So they may choose to push in a large wedge of tanks, and if they were successful, they may move themselves down and get down to this defensive line, and that's when I think we would see the first real test of the Ukrainian offensive, and is it able to get through there? One of the challenges that the Ukrainians really have here is that they do need to do something decisive, and if they don't manage to do something decisive, then I think they can quite logically expect a Russian counteroffensive. Now, at this stage, the Russians are clearly waiting for the Ukrainians to make their big move and to come down to the defensive lines. I think the Russians and the Ukrainians understand that the fact that the attacks are happening in this area of Zaporozhye is so that the Ukrainians can get down to the likes of Melitopol, Mariupol, and actually cut off the land bridge down here. That's a big ask for them to get through there and do that. And I guess even if they were successful in doing that and making that far and cutting that off, then they still then have to deal with a Russian counteroffensive. And there are reports coming out now, articles, that the Russians, one of the reasons that there hasn't been an announcement of a second mobilization is that they are getting thousands and thousands of volunteers per week to sign up as it is. I think the number that I read may have been up to like 13,000 in a week or something, which is a large number of people if that's happening week on week. So you can imagine that even if the Ukrainians are successful in the next few days of breaking further through here, they've got to then battle through those really fortified Russian lines. They've got to battle through more minefields. And then what shape would their forces be in by the time, let's say, they have reached Mariupol or Melitopol? Now, again, I'm going into full guess mode here, but Air Defender 2023, as I've mentioned before, is kicking off very soon. Now, Air Defender will see 220 or more Western jets in Germany, Poland, Romania, the Czech Republic, flying in exercises, and those exercises are to replicate the implementation of a NATO Article 5 response, where a NATO nation or state was under attack, and where there would be a combination of, I think there's something like nearly 28 different nations who are going to be involved in this. So there's a possibility, and I guess it could be foreseeable that somehow that defensive exercise could be turned into an offensive operation. And if that was done in the next couple of days or week in support of a large artillery push through here, then suddenly things could be different. Yeah, then there might be a real chance of Ukraine making it through and cutting the land bridge if they've got actual air superiority for a period of time. But I'm just guessing that this could be the big surprise that's been talked about. And the reason I'm suggesting this is because it feels like something of that size or nature really would need to be added into the current offensive to give it a chance of being really successful. And part of the reason that I've sort of taken that approach is when we look at what has happened in the first week of the offensive in terms of Ukrainian troop loss and Ukrainian armour losses, with upwards of getting near to 60 tanks being claimed to have been destroyed, with a number of those being Leopards, hundreds of pieces of armour confirmed as being, over 100, up to 150 confirmed as being destroyed, perhaps more now with yesterday's fighting. So many Bradleys are destroyed in one area that the Russians are now referring to that area as Bradley Square, and because there are so many Bradleys parked there. But that does bring me on to the topic and something that I'd like to talk a little bit about there. If we do just have a look here, some of the pictures of some of the minefields that the Ukrainians attempted to advance through in the first couple of days. I mean, some of the photos here show some very, very severe destruction of Western armour. In this picture here, there's 3 Leopards destroyed and a number of Bradleys. Interestingly, the Leopards here are the HMBVs, which seem to be carrying the full-width mine plows on them. So we've got this one here and this one here. And if I go back to this image, this one here carrying these full-width mine plows on them. Now, this is what these devices look like. Normally they're mounted on the front of a tank, and they have these 3 sort of skids just to keep them nicely balanced. And then these plows dig into the earth into a couple of feet of depth. And instead of trying to use rollers or flails to actually roll out in front and detonate the mines, the way that these operate is that they dig, lift and shift. So they clear a path through the dirt by just pushing the dirt over out of the way and pushing the mines out of the way. Now, while this does work, one of the challenges here is that if for any reason your tank, your plows, your mine clearing plows are disabled, then your tanks and armoured vehicles that want to progress now need to go around those mine clearers, and those mine clearers have built up effectively on either side of them a berm or a wall containing mines that they've cleared. So this may be part of the reason why we're seeing this sort of grouping and clumping of vehicles. Another reason may be here that once one of these vehicles does get into some sort of trouble, one may have struck a mine, others come to assist. Now, depending on how densely mined the fields are, they themselves may simply run into other mines, or they may actually line up alongside these other vehicles as a form of protection. If they've already got one disabled vehicle, well, if they can put that between them and the line of incoming fire from the enemy, then they've effectively doubled the amount of armour they've got in front of them. So that might explain why some of this has happened here. However, there is another line of thought which Simplicius, the thinker, has raised. I've got to say to you, if you haven't checked out Simplicius's Substack, please do. I put a link in the description for all these videos because it's such a good source of information. One of the reasons one of the other possible reasons why we're seeing this happen may be to do with these weapons, the ISDM. Now, the ISDM is a relatively new weapon. I think it came into action in 2021 for the Russians. And what it does, it's a truck-mounted rocket mine launching system. So this allows you to, from a range of up to about 15 kilometers, launch quite targeted rockets, which will then release shells containing mines. So you can remotely or in advance mine areas. These ISDMs also will then keep an electronic map of where they have laid these mines for you, so that your troops later on can move through and be aware of where they are. Some of these mines are quite technically advanced in that these mines can be configured to remain active for a period of time and then to effectively shut themselves off, so that you know that it's going to be an active minefield for, let's say, 48 hours while your enemy's in there. You hope to repel them in this time, and then you're able to safely drive through there after that period of time because you know they've disabled themselves. So what could be happening here is an approach where, for example, these mine clearers are allowed quite deep into a minefield, are doing their work. They're perhaps then engaged by ATGMs or by artillery, and while this is happening, you then use the ISDM to either to mine their exit route, so that as vehicles start to turn around and try and get out of there and retreat, they encounter mines that weren't there before. They may even be driving over the cleared paths that they were safely on before, and now they've been mined. Or another tactic that may be employed is that those ISDMs are used to mine directly onto the tanks in the existing minefield. So while they have cleared an area, now they're mined, and these are deployed all over them from the air. And then the use of something like a small thermobaric rocket could be launched into the area, which would then cause not only it, but all of the mines in the area to trigger. So effectively, you've just cast a blanket of mines over a bunch of artillery in one location, perhaps bunched up or in a line, because they're the first unit in the convoy may have been taken out, and you're able to mass detonate those. So while this hasn't been corroborated yet, it's definitely a line of thinking which could perhaps explain why we saw so many vehicles destroyed in the first 3 days in these minefields, and would also provide some level of reasoning to why these new recently NATO trained squads, such as the 37th and 47th Mechanised Brigade, who had all this NATO equipment and had been NATO trained, why it seemed in some cases surprising that they had suffered such high losses. So perhaps it was a different tactic. I don't think that any of the NATO trainers who would have trained the Ukrainians in the use of these weapons would have found themselves in a situation like this before, where they would be working their way through a heavily, perhaps densely mined minefield while being under attack from ATGMs, attack helicopters and artillery. You've got to remember that this is a very different scenario to what has happened in the recent skirmishes, wars that the US and West have been involved in, if we think of the likes of Afghanistan and Iraq, where the Americans and the Western forces held air superiority. Now, it seems as though a lot of Western military and army doctrine has been based upon the assumption that there will be air superiority. And when it is lacking, and so when things like multiple launch rocket systems, artillery, these advanced mining equipment, when that sort of thing can't be suppressed, then you would struggle to get through a minefield following your conventional approaches. And it seems as though they were following the conventional approach by leading with these mine clearing tanks first, and then convoys following behind them. But again, as we've seen a number of times, a convoy of armoured vehicles becomes very easy to pick off if you've got the air superiority in the area. And there have been a number of videos that have come out in the last week of the Russian attack helicopters, the alligators, just from a long way out, picking off these pieces of armour. Another note on those, some of those videos about the attack helicopters, there's been some comments that the footage and the visuals from those the night vision on the Russian attack helicopters is rubbish. However, I did see a very good comment on this, that some of those missiles, anti-tank missiles, travel at 600 meters a second, and that you can time in those videos how long it takes from when the chopper fires the missile to when it impacts the target. And by doing some simple math, you can figure out that actually some of those videos you're seeing are out at 10 or 11 kilometers distance. So the night vision capability on those Alligator helicopters at 10, 12 kilometers actually seems to be fine, seems to be completely workable. Look, that's about it. Just a quick one for today. A quick update on that. Please, if you're enjoying these shows, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to look to put another one out shortly on an article that has come out in Politico about the Pentagon starting to freak out about a future war with China, which I think will be an interesting topic. Thank you.